Hello and welcome. My name is Elizabeth Ziemba. I'm the president of Medical Tourism Training, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, The Accidental International Tourist, helping providers deliver care and get bills paid when visitors end up in the emergency department. Before we start the program, just a couple housekeeping issues. Feel free to use the chat function to introduce yourselves and to maybe say where you're from. And if you have questions, please use the Q&A box to put those questions, and we will get to those at the end of the presentation. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Eric Bergman. Thank you, Eric.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I'm so pleased to be here. I will start a little bit of introduction about myself. I am both a nurse and a former flight attendant, as well as a case manager and a medical escort. I began flying for American Airlines in the early 1980s and spent 27 years there. And at the moment that 9/11 happened and the airline industry was in crisis, it seemed like a good opportunity for me to start thinking about other backup careers. And I went to nursing school and became a nurse. I've spent 5 years in a hospital working in inpatient hospice and oncology. And then I spent an additional 10 years as a case manager for an international travel organization, combining both my nursing experience, my travel experience, and in that capacity I also worked as a medical escort, which I continue to do to this day, although I've moved into a different part of case management now. So just a few disclaimers and disclosures. I don't have any conflicts of interest in this presentation. All the materials are prepared based on my experience and or my opinion. The source material is cited if I didn't dream it up myself. And there are a number of slides that show various products. They're simply there for providing a little bit of example and background. There's no product that I wish to endorse through this presentation. So our objectives today are to identify the risks and obstacles faced by people who get sick or injured in a foreign country and explain the variety of insurance coverage that travelers may have and how to access those benefits. We'll present the nuances of planning for an international transition of care, one of the most complex transitions of care you can imagine, and identify ways that healthcare professionals and support services can help their clients to travel safely, recover from unexpected illnesses or injury when away from home, and access resources to protect them in the event of a medical emergency. So to begin with, I think that this is a subject that is important to many, many different kinds of providers, both clinical and non-clinical providers who are working with tourism, business travelers, and that includes almost everybody these days because travel is growing and sometimes something goes wrong. So despite the increasing cost, the increasing ease of international travel, also coupled with rapid improvement in communication, striving a growth of international travel for business and pleasure. Except for the COVID years, international travel has been growing globally for decades. The data shows significant recovery for travel. In the US, the Transportation Security Administration publishes daily totals of passengers crossing through US security checkpoints, and those numbers show that the US has returned to pre-pandemic levels already this year, and more people are traveling to more destinations. More international travelers have ended up in emergency departments in need of urgent care without insurance coverage or without knowing that they have it. So we'll start with a little case study, a little example of our friends Mike and Jennifer, who were on their fabulous honeymoon in the Caribbean, and they had a motorbike accident and they got sent to the hospital, both of them. Mike had 5 rib fractures and a pneumothorax, a collapsed lung, and he also had a pelvic fracture. And Jen had a humerus fracture and severe abrasions and burns, but she also had a pelvic fracture. They have great U.S. health insurance. When they went on their vacation, they didn't give another thought to health care or medical costs because they both had good insurance through their businesses. But they learned that their health insurance does not cover them outside of the United States. Um, and they also learned that their matching pelvic fractures was going to prevent them from sitting up for 4 to 6 weeks. And so they can't get on a commercial flight to fly home. Um, it would cost them about $45,000 to both get on an air ambulance. And fortunately for them, because they would be very stable, low acuity, low impact patients, they could probably both share the same air ambulance, saving them a tremendous amount of money. But still, they don't have the $45,000. Their family doesn't have the $45,000. So the first 4 to 6 weeks of their marriage gets to be spent in a Caribbean hospital. Other things can go wrong when people are traveling. If you maybe use a CPAP to help with your sleep apnea, your machine might break. What if you're in a different country and you don't know how to get replacement parts? What happens if you lose your medication? I had one client who called to say, my 3-year-old just flushed all my pills down the toilet this morning. Um, it's really difficult to get prescriptions refilled in a foreign country or even in a city that's distant from your own in many cases. So how do you get help? Who's going to pay you for these things, or who's going to help you pay for these things? And what if you're incapacitated? Like Mike and Jen, they couldn't sit up to get on an airplane. What if something has happened that causes you to not be able to breathe too well? Perhaps you've contracted pneumonia while you were traveling, and it's taking a while to recover, and you can't leave the hospital without oxygen. You still are going to need support. There's a lot of bills to pay, but there are things you can do to protect yourself if you plan ahead. To make sure that we're again all on the same page here, I have another little case study. This is a 23-year-old male who was traveling from Brazil to the southern United States. And he showed up in the ER complaining that he had frank blood in his stool for 2 days. He had a past medical history of a gastric bypass 2 years ago. And when he arrived, his hemoglobin was quite low. 7.4 is low enough to begin considering transfusion. And they did give him 2 units of packed red blood cells right there in the emergency room. And then they admitted him for further evaluation. They did an upper and lower endoscopy. So they did a colonoscopy, and then they took a camera and looked down his throat to see if they could find anything in his digestive system that was causing him to bleed. He was passing clots in his stools, and he received another unit of packed red blood cells that night. The endoscopies didn't show anything. When they tested his hemoglobin after all 3 units of packed red blood cells, he was only at 8.1. He was able to eat, and he had no further bleeding by 2 p.m. the next day, and he was super concerned. He didn't have very many resources. He and his friends had basically spent all their money on their flights and their hotels and playing while they were in the southern U.S., and he did not want to miss his flight home. He didn't think that he could afford to buy a new ticket. He didn't think that he'd be able to get the ticket changed. And so he insisted he had to be gone. He had to be let go. And the doctor obliged, discharging him with a fit to fly letter, and then instructions to see a doctor in Brazil when he got home. Clearly, the physicians and the staff at the hospital were not thinking about an international transition of care. They were not thinking about what the prospects of this person's travel were. It was going to be an 8-hour flight to Brazil in the middle of the night. Most of the flight is out over open ocean. Most of the places that you could possibly put the plane down in the event of an emergency do not have adequate healthcare systems. And the other really huge red flag is that this guy's hemoglobin only increased a tiny bit with a lot of blood transfusion. he really is not fit to fly, and could be in pretty significant danger. Fortunately for him, he called his parents at the last minute and they reminded him that he did actually have travel insurance. We'll get to how he had it a little later on. But Brazilian credit cards are really quite amazing in some regards. And so he was able to contact me and I was able to help him to rebook his flight and stay in the southern US until he could be better evaluated and was safer to fly. And we covered the bills. So, how are you going to help your clients who show up in your facility or show up doing business with you? Or if they wish to do business and they have a chronic illness, and or maybe not business, maybe just personal travel. Maybe there's somebody in the family having a destination wedding and they'd like to travel, or maybe they just have that bucket list they want to fill. They shouldn't be disqualified just because they have chronic issues. We should know how to help them. So let's have a few definitions to be sure we're all on the same page here. Travel assistance companies administer travel insurance. Travel insurance is a specific policy that provides protections to travelers. International insurance is coverage for issues or problems that occur outside the person's country of origin, the thing that Mike and Jen could have used. And domestic insurance will cover you for issues or problems that occur in your country of origin, even if you're not within your home city. So if you're traveling within your own country and you have domestic insurance, you're probably well covered from a medical insurance standpoint. Here are two in particular definitions that people don't understand well and sometimes get into trouble. Repatriation is a support to get home, and evacuation is a move to the nearest center of excellence. Many insurance policies will talk about evacuation coverage, and many lay people will assume that that would mean they'd evacuate me home, but not so much. They'll move you to the nearest center of excellence. In Mike and Jen's case, they were in a Caribbean hospital that was fully adequate to their needs. So their evacuation insurance, had they had any, wouldn't have moved them. And then a center of excellence is any well-known institution with an international reputation and some accreditation to demonstrate that they meet certain medical standards of the accrediting organization. So travel assistance is a term that we use throughout much of the world, and it refers to service that providers help primarily in medical emergencies during travel. Travel assistance is different from medical, travel, or trip cancellation insurance. It is the actual act of providing support and assistance, usually in the process of administering the travel insurance or medical insurance benefits. So travel assistance provides immediate support or assistance in case of an emergency, emergency medical evacuation or repatriation, assistance with travel arrangements for family traveling with an injured or ill person or to get to an injured or ill person. They also can help with worldwide referrals. Most travel assistance companies have a big network of providers and facilities that they have evaluated and put their trust in, and they can recommend a safe place for people to receive medical care if they need it away from home. Usually these referral networks are proprietary networks, and so you can't get access to them unless you have purchased their insurance and thereby gained access to their network. And they also provide assistance with other kinds of services that you might need as a traveler, not just medical emergencies, but they can replace stolen credit cards or documents. They can provide you with a cash advance should your wallet be stolen. They also can help you get in touch with the embassy or the consulate. And for my client whose 3-year-old flushed the medication down the toilet, replace prescriptions. And something that many people don't think about, if you die away from home, it turns out to be extremely difficult for your family to get your body home. And travel assistance will also assist with making those arrangements, which can be quite complex, not to mention expensive. Travel insurance, by comparison, is set up to compensate for costs in an emergency. They'll reimburse you for lost luggage. They'll reimburse you for the non-refundable expenses if something were to cancel your trip. Depending on the details of the policy, maybe you got sick and you couldn't go, but your insurance covered it. Also, depending on the details, maybe it wouldn't in that case. But most of them have policies that are pretty clear about, if the airline fails with a connection, or if they lose your luggage, or the weather sometimes will be covered. A number of things. We'll get also into looking carefully at that insurance coverage. And then medical emergencies are probably the most expensive kinds of things that you may get. Even if you had a fabulous trip planned and something went wrong and the whole thing were canceled, one small medical emergency could cost you far more than the cost of the trip. Now, the travel insurance may or may not come with a travel assistance service. The better travel insurance policies will be tied to a high quality travel assistance company that will provide you support in the event of an emergency. But one thing to keep in mind, travel insurance is not major medical insurance. If you happen to work in a facility that is treating someone who's come from a foreign country and they have insurance, you may breathe a sigh of relief from the financial standpoint of your institution, but there may be significant limits to what that insurance will cover. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Travel insurance is for emergencies, for immediate care. It's not usually for any kind of planned care, not for the medical tourism kind of travel to go and have your hip replaced by the fabulous Indian doctor that you have learned about, who does it for less than you can get it in your home country, or for any kind of cosmetic surgeries. And typically, if you were in some kind of a serious medical situation, maybe you broke your hip, your travel insurance typically will not cover for the rehabilitation after you've had surgery to stabilize you and replace the hip, but they will probably cover to get you home to your home insurance, your home medical system, where you could then recover. Major medical insurance covers both emergencies and non-emergency care. It will cover planned care, will cover rehabilitation and skilled nursing and home care. In the United States, where everybody has their own major medical coverage through work, well, not everybody, but many people have major medical through home or work. Some of those plans do carry a rider that provides coverage overseas, and they will take or they will consider non-emergent planned care for people who, say, are working abroad for an extended period of time, or maybe traveling for an extended period of time. There are a lot of travel assistance companies, and I want to talk a little bit about how to work with them if you're trying to support somebody who's been traveling and is ill or injured. This slide depicts a few of the major logos, or the logos of major companies that are available in the United States. There are many, many more companies available. Sometimes when you are working with someone in a hospital, they may have travel insurance and they might not know. So you need to ask them about it. They may have, in the heat of everything else, forgotten to mention that they have travel insurance and begin a claim. A lot of premium credit cards will provide coverage, and people will not be aware. Remember my fellow from Brazil, he had a premium Visa card that provided a pretty decent medical benefit, as long as he had purchased some part of his travel arrangements on that credit card. There are also private insurances that people have from their home countries that they might cover foreign travel, and they might not think to ask. They may have assumed that their home insurance will cover it and be shocked to find out it doesn't, like Mike and Jen. But they may have other kinds of insurance. In the United States, insurance companies are competing for employer business. And one of the things that they have begun to offer as just a kind of a little tag on to the major medical benefits that they are supplying is some limited evacuation and repatriation insurance, or a little travel insurance. So people might actually have a little something through their work that they didn't notice when they were signing up for their work insurance. There might be a rider on other insurance, their auto insurance or their home insurance, or through some life insurance policy. There may be a little additional bonus that was used to try and entice people to buy the product. And sometimes people are members of organizations. They have an association with maybe a union that they work for, and the union has some coverage for their members who travel. Or in the United States, the AARP, the American Association of Retired People, has some benefits to their members, and you can get support in certain ways. It's not huge, but it's a little something. And sometimes if you're traveling for business, your employer will take responsibility and assist as well. So these are all important things to ask your client, who may or may not think that they have coverage, and get them to look and scour to see whether they have something that they didn't know about. So it's also important, if you're working with these people, to know what their coverage will take care of, and how will they be asked to pay for it. Will they cover only emergency medical? Will they cover some rehab? Is there repatriation, or is there just evacuation insurance? And what level of the benefit? I've worked with insurance programs that will only cover $20,000 of medical cost. In the United States, that goes away in the first 15 minutes in the hospital. And the insurance company is very happy to just pay out the $20,000, and that's that. You need to find out precisely what it is that your client has and how you will help them manage that. Sometimes the policies are set up to pay and then claim it back. And many people are not in a position to pay a giant bill. But frequently you can negotiate with the insurance company, and they will advance some payment if there is a very major problem. And I have worked with clients in certain countries where they're not permitted to leave the country until they have paid all their medical bills, or their insurance has paid it. So this can become a pretty significant issue. Another thing to understand is that there'll be a number of personnel at any travel assistance company that you'll talk to. There'll be a medical team, either nurses or physicians, and they'll make judgments about the necessity of the medical care. They'll judge what is emergent, what's urgent, and what's routine. And remember, the insurance may not cover anything that's routine. And they may put off anything urgent because it might be less expensive for them to send a medical escort and move the person home again, to have a stable, urgent issue taken care of at home instead of on the travel insurance bill. That medical team also evaluates what's needed to stabilize them, and we'll talk with the medical team at the facility where the person is. They can make recommendations. They will be extremely well versed in what the various requirements are, what level of safety is needed, or level of stability in order to safely get somebody home. And they will also be evaluating the care in the facility where the patient is to determine, is it actually adequate to the patient's needs? And they will make decisions about where to evacuate the patient, whether it be across town to a different hospital, or across an ocean to another country. And then there are also other personnel that will assist with the logistics. They are sometimes referred to as the case managers. In the United States, there's a lot of debate and complaint among medical case managers about that title, and the confusion that it offers. In the United States, we would like to believe that a case manager is a medically qualified professional in some regard, but the logistics personnel will simply be managing bills, claim statements, adjudicating the coverage, and can explain what the coverage is. Sometimes they'll do the travel planning and the logistics for a return home. So one thing to remember about the medical insurance team is that they can only see as much as they're told over the phone. This is a quote from the associate medical director that I used to work with at AXA Partners, and it really gets to the heart of the matter. There was a time when I was working with a patient who we were moving from the Caribbean back to Europe, and he'd fallen ill on a cruise and needed help home. And our final step in any plan for a major transport was to talk directly with the patient about the plans, go over every detail of the plan, and make sure that the patient is comfortable with it and knows what will happen to them. This man had contracted pneumonia and couldn't fly unless he had oxygen support, and he didn't know how to manage the oxygen, and we were sending a nurse to help him with that. And so we got through the whole plan, and I asked him, is there anything else you need to know, or does everything seem adequate? And he said, well, yeah, where's my damn leg? And I said, what? And no one had mentioned to any of our nurses when we were talking with them that this man was an above-the-knee amputee, and someplace in the transfer between the cruise and the hospital, his leg had been lost, his prosthesis. He also had a major electric wheelchair. No one had told us that either. These are things that made the whole plan significantly more complicated, and in fact had to be scrapped for 2 days while we redid all the planning. So very important to understand that you may see things that the medical team on the phone can't see, and it's really quite important to make sure everybody's on the same page. And I think I pretty well talked over this slide, so I'm going to move right along. So let's talk a little bit about what it takes to get people home again, that planning of an international transition of care. To determine medical stability, there are physicians that could be worked with at both ends of the trip. If you're fortunate enough to have a travel assistance company, they will have physicians and nurses that will be well versed in the various rules and regulations, various protocols for moving based on people's situation. And the airlines also have significantly developed guidelines. You're required to fill out paperwork and get medical clearance from most major airlines if you have been admitted to a hospital within 3 days of your travel. And you can work with the airline's medical team to learn what is needed for the person to travel safely. There are also a lot of international medical associations and national agencies or departments that put out their own travel guides. The Aerospace Medical Association guideline for airline travel has a PDF that is a living document. You can go and see what experts are recommending based on a number of different modes of medical necessity. And there are others. There's one from the Netherlands. The Canadians have a guide that they put out through their Air Transport Association. The UK Civil Aviation Authority used to have a 3-page work of art that was just a really beautiful condensed list of various conditions and precisely what was needed. It was a tremendously useful document. I think they must have decided that it was not fully adequate, because when I went looking for it yesterday to make sure that my links were all okay, it wasn't the same. This website that's linked here still has guidance for medical professionals, but it's not the artistic 2-page PDF that it used to be. Nonetheless, quite useful information if you should have someone that you needed to help sort out medical problems and see whether they were safe to travel. the Civil Aviation Authority guidelines will show you basic rules of thumb for what level of support and how many days post various kinds of issues people are faced with, and what needs to be in place for them to travel. So in general, we can talk about some of the things that you have to think about before someone travels. You need to know, is the patient stable? Is there likelihood that whatever they had might get worse or might suddenly recur before they were able to get home? Will being on an airplane cause a problem? Although commercial aircraft are pressurized, they're not pressurized to sea level. And so there is a significant change in the altitude, usually up to about 8,000 feet when you take off. And because of the way oxygen works and the way your body has to work much harder to stay fully oxygenated when you get to a higher altitude. Anybody who's had the unfortunate experience of living through a little bout of altitude sickness will understand the difficulty. If you have had pneumonia, or if you've had some kind of other event, a cardiac arrest that might compromise your breathing and your oxygenation and your circulatory system, that change could be significant. And so you need to make sure that the patient is able to tolerate that change when they get on board the airplane. Another thing that will happen is that any gases inside the body will expand. Basically, the pressure of the air at sea level is much greater on the outside of your body than when you go up to 8,000 feet. A very good example of this is when I was a flight attendant. We would take off sometimes and there'd be this enormous bang from an overhead bin, and everyone would jump, and then you'd open the overhead bin and potato chips would rain down. That vacuum sealed, not vacuum sealed, but the sealed bag that was sealed at sea level with a fairly thin skin is able to contain the pressure of the oxygen or the air on the inside of the bag against the atmospheric pressure on the outside, which holds it all kind of together. But when the atmospheric pressure on the outside becomes much less, the inside pressure doesn't change until the bag explodes. This will also happen to your head should you have a pneumothorax or a pneumocephalus. Perhaps you've had some kind of head injury that cracked your skull, but it's now been patched up, and there's a little bit of air inside your cranial vault there. As you go up, that air will expand and crush your brain, and much in the same way that the growing presence of blood inside the brain causes a stroke, the air pressure would be a problem. So you cannot fly if you have air inside your cranial vault. Also, if you have a collapsed lung, or if your lungs are not completely healed from some kind of injury to them, you could have very significant issues when that pressure changes. So here's a little slideshow of some modes of transport, just because they're fun and I love airplanes. This is an air ambulance, very fancy corporate jet. However, on the inside, doesn't look so good. It's pretty filled with equipment. One of the problems when people are moved by air ambulance is that the air ambulance can only accommodate the medical team and the patient, and sometimes one other companion. There's not room for luggage. So if you're traveling with a big family, you may be having to find other ways to catch up with your loved one after they've been emergently evacuated on an air ambulance. This is one of my favorite modes of transport. This works well for the patient who's going to need significant support during travel. It is essentially an ICU room. They put it right into the middle of a cabin of a great big airplane. This is a product that is particular to Lufthansa. I don't know of any other airline that offers it. But if you were, for instance, traveling with your family and someone became seriously ill, you could all travel together. They take out some seats and they put this pod into the middle of the cabin. The rest of the family can travel as regular airline passengers, and inside the pod is an ICU unit. Lufthansa even supplies the ICU staff to manage the patient during the transport. There are some significant limitations, money being among them. But even beyond that, Lufthansa's routes, they don't fly enormous two-aisle aircraft to every destination they go to. So there are some pretty significant limitations. When you are pretty severely incapacitated, however, you could use a stretcher. You can see here in this picture, the seats are all folded down, and there's a stretcher that's been superimposed. It's attached into the same system on the floor of the aircraft that holds the seats, and then the passenger can be loaded into the airplane on a stretcher. They do not have to be able to move or even sit up. They're carried up to the side of the airplane with a similar lift truck that you can see the catering being moved on board, and then they just come in through one of the non-passenger entry doors. Here's some other pictures of moving a stretcher. This one is a little less close to the overhead bin and comes with a pretty spiffy curtain, but you are sitting in the middle of the economy cabin. It is not exactly a private event when you do that, and of course you will incur a whole lot of curiosity. So it's in some regards not the ideal way to travel. However, if you can't sit up like Mike and Jen and you can't afford an air ambulance, this is a significantly less expensive mode of travel. And I should say that there are relatively few airlines that offer stretcher travel as well, more than the ICU pod, but no US airlines offer stretcher travel. Many of the European airlines do, and a few of the Asian airlines do. And then there is the international business class. These seats lay flat, and it turns out that if you can sit up for the 30 minutes or so of taxi and takeoff and then landing and taxi, you can be flat for the rest of the trip. There's lots of space here for a nurse or another companion to provide support. There's room to put a portable oxygen concentrator down. And so transport in a business class seat is a pretty common thing that travel assistance companies will do, and provides for pretty significant space for many things: broken limbs, difficulty from post-stroke, and immobility issues and that sort of thing. Many of the airlines have good grab bars in at least one bathroom, and the flight crew should know where to send you to get to them. They're also bigger so that there's a little space for a companion to get in and assist. The flight crew will certainly not assist. You have to bring your own assistant. And most airlines, most of the big airlines in the world, have aisle chairs. My friend Terry posed for me one day and showed the aisle chair that folds up and fits in a closet on board the airplane, but then can be opened up and you can move up and down the narrow aisle of the airplane. There are also aisle chairs in airports that are narrower than a standard wheelchair that fit down the aisle of an aircraft. So how do you decide where you're going to put people? Well, basically an air ambulance provides the most support available. You can be vented, you can be neurologically, you need to be fairly stable, and you can be in the midst of cardiac issues, and there's enough of a staff to help you. This would also be true of that ICU pod on Lufthansa. And of course, this is for repatriation kind of travel, not evacuation. And in the event of a need for an evacuation, the risk versus reward, there's no care here. We'll put you on this plane. It won't be adequate care, but it will be better, and we'll get you to the right care. A lot of these rules will go out the window depending on the situation. For stretcher travel, you have to be able to breathe well enough to tolerate that altitude change. In general, the rule of thumb is about 95% saturation at sea level, with less than or equal to 2 liters of O2, because it's hard to put more than 4 liters of oxygen on board a commercial plane. It can be done, it can become rather expensive, and so generally this rule of thumb. You also have to be calm. You can't have agitation, you can't have outbursts, because you can't be disrupting the cabin. And you have to be fairly stable, less of a less of a support and less likelihood of a deterioration because there's much less medical equipment and medical personnel available to help you. To travel in that business class seat, you need to be able to walk on board the airplane. You need to be able to sit up for takeoff and landing, and then you have to have pretty significantly the same kinds of O2 status, and the emotional status is also important because, again, you can't be disrupting the cabin. And if you're going to travel without any support, most airlines will require you to be able to get into the seat on your own. They'll require you to not use oxygen unless you are somebody who is a chronic oxygen user and has experience at managing your own oxygen, and you'll need to be able to eat. You can travel in the business class cabin with a nurse escort who could provide IV medications, who could provide tube feedings, who could manage a tube. You won't be doing tube feedings on board the airplane because, again, that pressurization change would be a risk for vomiting, and so you can have a nurse who will manage those things for you during travel. So how do you help your patient get home? You have to coordinate post-acute care, and trying that international travel, that coordination of the post-acute care is really tough. The airlines are going to want you to provide a fit-to-fly certificate, so you'll have to talk with the treating physician. To get post-acute care, you can call the doctors at home, you can call the hospitals in the home country, and usually get some assistance in getting that set up. If you have a travel assistance company, they will do it all for you. A tremendous benefit. One of the things that I point out to my case management friends who work in acute care is, if you have an international traveler, find those acute care case managers and give them the case. You won't have to do any more work except for making sure that reports are provided accurately, and all of the transition and discharge planning will be done by the assistance team. You can rent portable oxygen concentrators that can travel with the patient. They are expensive. And depending on the airline, you may be able to provide evidence that the patient can adequately get trained to manage that prior to the flight. The systems are set up so that it can be returned from a home country upon arrival. And you can also, if you have money, find a travel assistance company and pay them to assist you. And there are also private case managers who will do this kind of work as well. So how do you find travel insurance? There's lots of travel insurance out there. This slide is an example of two websites that you can use to locate travel insurance. They're aggregators. If you put in a few basic parameters about your trip, they'll give you a list of different travel insurance with different prices, and then you can compare them and look at what the policies cover, what they don't cover. You can actually get a look at the real policies, so you can read them and know if it's going to be adequate for you. The reason for travel insurance is that really, no matter where you are in the world, as long as you have resources, you can get good care, you can get moved to good care. Sometimes it's better and cheaper than at home. Sometimes it's more expensive. So it really frequently comes down to the money, and the insurance will help you with that. Here's just a brief slideshow of some of the hospitals that I have taken people to and seen around the world. One of the things that I think many of us are prone to is a little bit of bias or making assumptions that might not necessarily be true about various places we could go. I was surprised when I started taking people back to the United Kingdom that a lot of the hospitals in the United Kingdom still have open wards. Not all, but some do. So you can see there are lots of patients in one ward here. I had the pleasure of going to this hospital in Florence one time, which you can't really make it out. We got there at 4 o'clock in the morning, so it was a little dark. But this building is ancient, and it's been retrofitted to become the hospital. and it was really quite entertaining to see some of the retrofits and some of the closets and the rooms, but functioned extremely well as a hospital. This was one of my favorite hospitals in Barbados. It's called, no, I've forgotten. It's on the bay. And this Bayview Hospital, it's a private hospital, has very good cardiac services, among other things. And it's quite an adequate facility, although it's quite small. This room has a beautiful view of the bay, really quite a nice facility. And then the Japanese hospitals were always entertaining to me. This picture stands out a lot these days. This is pre-pandemic. This picture was taken probably in about 2018 or 2017. And everyone was wearing masks then. When you came into the Japanese hospital, there was a box of masks, and people were asked to put on their mask when they entered the hospital, much like we are now almost everywhere we go. And another entertaining part of the Japanese hospitals is just how low their beds are. These beds didn't even come up to my knee. And that was the case in many of the Japanese facilities I was in, making it extremely easy for people to get in and out of their beds. This hospital is one of the I wouldn't say first, but it's an older major international facility that began catering to medical tourism and regional medical care for much of the Asian or the Pacific Islands. There are now a number of facilities in Thailand. Singapore has a lot of really high quality facilities that are every bit as good as any facility anyplace else in the world. It used to be that this hospital in Bangkok was not terribly expensive. Much of that has changed in the last 10 or 15 years. Medical care is rapidly becoming as expensive almost everywhere as it is in the United States. And that is to say, shockingly. And this place in Santiago was the nicest hospital I have ever been in. It had multiple buildings on a giant campus. This is the emergency room. It had 44 bays. I think that says 44 there. Everything was pristine and perfect. There was a giant facility for the staff. And the night that I was there, it was actually kind of quiet. There was only one patient. But nonetheless, a very nice hospital that provided excellent care to our Japanese patient who we picked up there. So you should be able to offer some advice about how to choose travel insurance and how to protect yourself if you're trying to help your clients who may have some possibility of a medical condition worsening while they're traveling. And of course, any of us has the possibility of some massive medical emergency, an automobile accident, or we can't remember which side of the street the cars are running down and we step off the street looking the wrong direction, or step off the curb looking the wrong direction. So good travel insurance will cover pre-existing conditions, those things that you might have. Have you had some cardiac issues? Do you take medication to maintain your blood pressure? Will those things be covered? And do they have a good travel assistance company that will provide you 24/7 support? Not just 24/7 support, but 24/7 decision making. And are the benefits robust enough? You don't want to buy that policy that pays $20,000 of your medical expenses if you're traveling to the United States or any place that doesn't have a really solid national healthcare system. The not so good ones will be limited in all these areas. The other shocking thing about this is you have to read the fine print. They're not going to tell you what they're going to cover, what they're not going to cover. They'll be happy to sell you whichever policy is up for sale. You need to look through and think about what your situation is, read the details, and don't count on your own ability to figure it out. All of the good travel assistance policies or travel insurance policies will provide you with a phone number you can call to actually talk to their staff to detail your conditions. And just a little reminder of why you might need this insurance. It's the cost. Everything is just tremendously expensive. If you have lots of money, and you have credit cards where you can, in an emergency, charge $80,000 or $100,000, you probably are in pretty good shape to self-insure. These policies are not terribly expensive, so it's well worth having a look at it. So to conclude, we're going to be dealing with an increased number of traveling patients. All of us, in whatever capacity we are working, will be confronted with people from other countries coming to see us or coming to our communities or our facilities. We may very well be working with people who we will be advising to assist in travel or medical care abroad. That will be an important moment for you to be able to step forward and offer good, solid advice. And the more that there's support being made available to people with disabilities, which is happening worldwide now, the more there's going to be increasingly complex people far away from home who may need help, and you should be prepared to assist them should something terrible happen. I've provided a number of resources with the slide pack, so that if you have a need in the future, you can refer back and use some of these links to find some assistance in moving people. The one thing that I don't have a link to is the place that will provide you with $100,000 gratis because you're in trouble. That usually seems to be the major problem. All of the other services will cost money.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Eric, for all of this vital information, whether we're looking to advise clients, patients about travel insurance, or perhaps this is insurance that we want to purchase for ourselves. So we have a few minutes for questions. If any of our participants would like to ask a question, there should be a toolbar somewhere on your screen. It's on the lower screen on my computer, and you're welcome to type your questions in there. I have a couple questions for you, Eric. First of all, you talked about the increasing number of travelers with disabilities who are enjoying travel as they should.
Oh yeah.
And
Yep.
what I've seen and been tracking lately is the number of wheelchairs and other assistive devices that get damaged during transit. And I'm wondering where that sort of damage is covered. Is that routinely covered in travel insurance? Is there a special provision that people should be looking for to insure wheelchairs and other devices?
I don't know the answer to that question. I know, as a former airline employee, one of the things that I was constantly attentive to was the way in which wheelchairs and other things were being treated by the ground staff. And I would frequently lecture my fellow employees, that's actually somebody's legs you're dealing with. You better treat it better. My understanding is the airlines maintain a certain amount of liability, so that the airline may be the primary source of funding for repairs. Of course, the real difficulty is that those devices are critical. If you get there and it's damaged, what do you do? I should think that a good travel assistance company should, at a minimum, be able to assist you in finding a rental equipment and more equipment. And I don't know if there would need to be a specific set aside for that, or whether that's something that would just routinely be covered as under some part of the medical provision. But it would be well worth a conversation with the insurance company if you were traveling with disabilities. And now I will have a list of something else to add to another presentation I do about traveling with disabilities.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. And a second question for you, it's maybe this is a little bit stranger, but with certain types of insurance, if you file a claim, such as with homeowners insurance or auto insurance, if you file a claim and the claim is paid, next time when you go to extend your insurance, you'll find that your insurance gets canceled. Is this
Mhm.
something that typically happens with travel insurance? That if you buy travel insurance, you file a claim, and then next time when it's time to buy it again or to extend it, you find that the company doesn't want to work with you anymore?
Well, there's a lot of answers to that. There are a lot of different kinds of insurance. There are travel insurance policies that you can buy as an annual policy for someone who travels all the time. And I should think that there is some evaluation that might increase your annual premium when your annual premium comes around again if you've had a bunch of claims. If you are purchasing on a trip-by-trip basis, in my experience, there are not questions about what happened last time. And I'm not sure that because of the way they are sold, that there's any real data collection that would target individual users. I mean, they pretty much will just sell to all comers, as far as I can tell. Now, caveat, I'm the medical side. I have never been on the sales side, so I don't know for sure.
Okay.
But there are so many different plans that there shouldn't be a real significant issue. Now, where you're going to get caught, though, is a pre-existing condition. Did you fully
Yes.
recover? Was it recent? So that might be where you would get caught. And
Okay.
then you mentioned extending. If you are sick and you want to extend, a good policy should simply cover you until you're home safely. If you are already traveling and you want to stay longer, some policies have limits. They won't insure you for more than a 90-day trip, or they won't insure
Right.
you for a 30-day trip. So, but
Great.
you usually buy another policy if you need to.
Okay. We've got two questions. So the first one is, how can hospitals participate more to provide care in the traveler's destination country? I believe what this is getting to, and if it's not, then I will ask you. What about the follow-up care? So someone ends up in your emergency room, you arrange or work with the travel assistance company to get them back home. What about that Brazilian patient who was told when you get back to Brazil, schedule yourself for some type of
Mhm.
treatment or procedure? Um, is there a gap there in the transition of care?
In my experience, yes. We would try as a travel assistance company to make sure people followed up, but the policy terminates upon arrival at home. And so we're no longer engaged. From a US legal standpoint, we don't have a right to medical information any longer when they're not our client. Um, so yeah, I think that that is a significant issue that should be discussed. And I don't know quite how to address it because we're siloed within countries, let alone cross borders. So I think that that's a significant issue for somebody who has suffered a major illness. One of the things that my travel assistance company did was to try to establish a very clear connection with the primary care provider and turn patients directly into their care with a planned visit with a primary care provider within 24, 48 hours of arrival home, at least for anything significant.
What about the hospital? Yeah. What about the hospital that discharged this hypothetical Brazilian patient? Should there be a system or protocol in place for about the follow-up care?
While they're still in country, there are definitely mechanisms and systems in place to follow up. There's, outpatient clinics that many U.S. hospitals run. I can't really speak for other country systems. My experience was to remove people as rapidly as possible unless they were fully stable. Um, so I'm not sure whether a place that has a national healthcare system would have a place to fit the patient into to follow them or not. But my experience has been that patients are treated pretty much the same, regardless of whether they're foreign or nationals, and they'll get the same kind of support system that's in place. Once they've crossed a border, though, I can't think of any instance where anybody followed up.
Okay, we have just maybe time for one quick question here. Who makes the final decision about which mode of travel the patient should take? At what point do they make the decision, and what specific criteria do they use?
Well, all of those criteria that I was sharing about how to determine if someone's stable to fly, talk about whether you need to have an escort, whether you need to have this level of care or that level of care. And so the level of care will determine the mode of transport. Patients will frequently be very, very anxious, and they won't want this or that. Family members will insist we have to have an air ambulance, even though they're probably stable enough to fly by themselves in an economy class flight on a commercial flight. So there's back and forth and argument. Family and patients can advocate for themselves, and in my experience, sometimes the travel assistance company didn't have a clear picture. So advocating and saying, hey, did you know this? Can sometimes significantly change the planning.
Okay, great. Well, we're out of time now. So first of all, Eric, I'd like to thank you very much for sharing your knowledge and experience with us. Thank you to the participants for joining us. Our contact information is here if you have some additional questions or if we can be of assistance to you. We'd be delighted to hear from you. So once again, thank you very much. And the recording will be made available and you'll have the link in a follow-up email from us, along with a handout that Eric has prepared to help you make good decisions about which travel insurance to select and the coverage that you should have. Once again, thank you very much. Bye-bye now.